The first breath I took outside the car felt like a shard of winter glass in my lungs. Boston in December has that particular cold that slices through coats and gloves. A sharp reminder that you are alive, whether you want to be or not. I tightened my scarf, glanced up at the glowing facade of the Clarendon Museum, and told myself I could do this. I could walk into that building alone. The Winter Arts Gala was already in full bloom. Through the grand glass doors, I could see the glittering chandeliers, the swirl of gowns and tuxedos, and the familiar rhythm of a string quartet playing something festive. I had walked these same steps so many times before, but always with Daniel's hand at my back, always as the second half of someone else's story. Tonight, I was just Grace Miller. Nobody's wife. Nobody's shadow. The valet closed my door with a soft thud, and the cold bit my cheeks pink as I approached the entrance. The museum steps were lined with golden light, the kind that makes even ordinary people look like they belong in a painting. Couples were posing for photos against a backdrop of glittering snowflake installations, their laughter floating into the night air. I paused at the bottom of the staircase, adjusting my navy gown, feeling its smooth satin against my palms. I had bought it for myself 3 months after the divorce, a promise that one day I would step back into the world, not as someone abandoned, but as someone whole. The lobby smelled faintly of pine and polished marble. Volunteers in black dresses offered champagne flutes on silver trays, and the soft clinking of glasses mixed with distant conversation. I let the warmth of the museum swallow me whole. For a moment, the heat, the music, and the sparkling light felt like an embrace, and I let myself breathe. I drifted toward the main hall, letting my eyes adjust to the familiar opulence. The high ceilings soared like cathedral vaults, and garlands of white roses hung from the balcony railings. The gala had always been Daniel's favorite night of the year. It was where he networked, bragged, and collected admiration like other people collected postcards. It used to be mine too, back when walking into this room meant feeling like we were unstoppable together. Now, it was different. My steps echoed against the marble as I walked without a hand to guide me, without a name to lean on. I noticed small things I never had before: the way the light fractured on the crystal chandeliers, the quiet scuff of the violin bows, the nervous glance of a young intern carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres. For the first time, the gala wasn't a stage for us. It was a living world I could enter on my own terms. A few guests turned to look at me as I passed. I didn't know if they recognized me or were just assessing my presence like people do in rooms like this. I lifted my chin slightly, not with arrogance, but with the quiet resolve of someone who had learned to survive being invisible. My heels clicked steadily, each step a heartbeat, each breath a reminder: I belong here. In the corner of the lobby, a large mirror framed in gold caught my reflection. I paused, almost startled. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had signed divorce papers under fluorescent courthouse lights 6 months ago. Her shoulders were squared, her hair pinned in a loose twist, and the subtle navy of her dress brought out the warmth in her eyes. She didn't look broken anymore. I took a flute of champagne from a passing server, let the bubbles kiss my lip, and stepped fully into the grand hall. The music swelled, and the night opened like a book I wasn't sure I was ready to read, but I had already turned the first page. The first thing I noticed was the sound: laughter. Not just any laughter, but the low, rolling kind that I could recognize even through a wall of music and conversation. My chest tightened before I even turned my head. Across the grand hall, near the champagne fountain, Daniel Miller was holding court. He looked exactly the way I remembered him in these settings: polished, confident, magnetic. His tuxedo was sharp, his salt and pepper hair catching the light just enough to suggest experience without age. People leaned toward him the way they always had, as if gravity bent in his favor. And then I saw her, Chloe Young. Her red dress clung like a challenge to the room, a flame among winter tones. She had one hand looped tightly through Daniel's arm, the other brushing his shoulder as she laughed too loudly at something he said. Her posture wasn't relaxed. It was territorial. I knew that hold, that half step closer than necessary. I had lived that role once, smiling in the right moments, absorbing the silent rules of these rooms. The sight hit me like a sudden cold wind. For a second, the edges of the hall blurred, and I was back in that first empty night after he left. I had come home from a lecture to find the house quiet, his closet half empty, the note on the kitchen counter so painfully neat it could have been drafted by an assistant. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. Polite. Final. I remember sitting on the floor next to the fridge, still wearing my wool coat, listening to the hum of the appliance because it was the only sound in the house. My phone had buzzed with texts from colleagues and a single message from Daniel. I need something different. I hope you understand. I had stared at the words until the screen went black. The walls had felt wider that night, as if the house itself was surprised to see only one of us inside. For weeks afterward, I moved through life like a ghost. Lecturing, grading papers, heating canned soup, and lying awake under a ceiling that never answered. And now, here he was. Laughing. Whole. Untouched by the nights that had swallowed me. I didn't move. I let the sting bloom, and then settle. Like a match that flares before burning down to ash. My fingers tightened slightly around the stem of my champagne glass. It wasn't jealousy anymore. Not exactly. It was recognition. The sudden, raw awareness of everything I had survived and everything he had never had to face. Daniel's gaze drifted across the hall for a moment, skimming over guests and gilded columns until it landed on me. His smile faltered for just a heartbeat, a small flicker that most people would miss. But I saw it. He looked away quickly, saying something to Chloe, who followed his glance and stiffened, her hand tightening around his arm like a clamp. I exhaled slowly. For the first time in months, the pain didn't own me. I could feel it, acknowledge it, and let it pass through, instead of letting it hollow me out. A volunteer walked by with a tray of canapes, and I took one just to give my hands something to do. The string quartet shifted into a softer melody, and I found myself stepping away from the center of the room toward the quieter side gallery. I needed a moment, not to hide, but to breathe. As I walked, I traced the edge of my navy gown with my fingers. I had promised myself that wearing it tonight meant I was done apologizing for existing in my own story. Daniel's world no longer defined me. His laughter could echo across this hall all night, and I would still be here, standing on my own 2 feet. The gallery doors opened with a soft creak, letting in a wash of cooler air and the muted glow of the next room. I stepped inside, letting the sound of the crowd fade behind me, unaware that tonight was only just beginning to turn. I lingered in the side gallery for a few minutes, letting the quiet settle my heartbeat. The walls were lined with modern sculptures, all smooth curves and steel reflections, and for a moment, I watched myself flicker in their polished surfaces, fragmented, reshaped, almost whole. When I finally returned to the main hall, the sound of laughter met me again, louder this time. Daniel and Chloe were now in the center of the room, surrounded by a small circle of guests. Their conversation had the rhythm of performance, Chloe touching his arm at every punchline, Daniel lifting his glass with the confidence of a man who had never tripped over a single consequence in his life. I slipped along the edge of the room, staying half in shadow, and told myself I was just observing. But my eyes betrayed me. They kept finding him. I watched Chloe tilt her head back in that perfect social laugh, the kind that announces itself to the room. She leaned close to an older man I vaguely recognized from the board of the museum, telling some story with bright gestures. Daniel nodded along, adding details like he was curating his own legend. This had always been his gift, making success look effortless, as if the world simply bent itself to his will. I took a sip of champagne, letting the bubbles sting my tongue, and forced myself to turn toward the paintings on the wall. I was studying this brushwork on a snowy landscape when a familiar voice called my name. Grace? Grace Miller? I turned, and there was Margaret Peterson, silver hair, pearls, the kind of woman who had been attending these galas since before I ever met Daniel. She stepped closer with a bright smile, air kissed my cheek, and looked me up and down with the warmth of a seasoned socialite. "It's been ages. How is your gallery? Are you still painting?" The question was simple, but it pressed against a tender place I hadn't realized was still bruised. My gallery, my work. The tiny studio above a coffee shop where I had tried to stitch myself together after the divorce. The canvases that had sat in silence for weeks, because I couldn't bear to pick up a brush. I forced a polite smile. Yes, I'm still painting. It's small, but it keeps me busy. Her expression faltered for just a second, then smoothed into something sympathetic. "Well, I must come by sometime. I remember the piece you did of the Charles River. Just lovely." "Thank you," I said softly. Behind her, over her shoulder, I saw Daniel glance my way again. He wasn't smiling this time. Chloe followed his gaze, and her fingers curled tighter around his arm, her laugh bright and brittle like a glass about to crack. I felt the old ache rise up, heavy and cold. But it didn't drown me. Not this time. I had learned how to hold my own weight. Margaret patted my hand and was whisked away by another guest, leaving me alone at the edge of the room. I stared down at the bubbles in my glass, thinking about all the nights I had spent with only that kind of silence for company. The house after he left had been a museum of unfinished things. Books half read, a kettle that whistled into empty rooms, a piano gathering dust because I couldn't bear to touch it. A burst of laughter from the circle around Daniel snapped me back to the present. I lifted my head, watched the scene for one more beat, and then made a choice. I would not stand frozen in someone else's story anymore. I set my glass on a passing tray and began walking toward the far terrace, where the night air and city lights promised a different kind of company. The terrace air was sharp and bracing, a relief after the hum of conversation inside. Boston's skyline stretched in silver and black, each light trembling against the night wind. I let the cold clear my head, inhaling until the sting in my lungs forced me to slow down. I wasn't planning to go back inside so soon, but I heard my name carried through the open doors, followed by laughter. Not the warm kind, the brittle kind. The one that used to make my stomach twist even when I didn't know why. When I re-entered the hall, the circle around Daniel had shifted closer to the gallery entrance. He stood at the center, Chloe on his arm, an audience of half a dozen people leaning in. Their expressions were lit with the kind of amusement people wear when they sense gossip in the air. I approached slowly, keeping to the edge, but the room had a way of making every movement visible. Daniel spotted me almost immediately, and his grin widened. Not the fond smile I had once known, but the practiced one he used in boardrooms and banquets. "Ah," he said, voice carrying over the music. "Speak of the artist herself, Grace Miller, everyone. You might remember her work from, well, the smaller shows." There was a ripple of polite laughter. Chloe tilted her head and added, too sweetly, "I've seen some of her pieces online. Very intimate." My throat tightened, but I stayed still, my hands relaxed at my sides. Daniel wasn't finished. "She's got her own little studio now," he continued, swirling his glass like he was making a toast. "Above a coffee shop, isn't it, Grace? Quite the bohemian life." The words hit their mark. They weren't cruel on the surface, but they were laced with the kind of condescension only someone who once knew your dreams could deliver. My face warmed under the chandeliers, but I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said, my voice even. "It's small, but it's mine." And sometimes, small spaces hold the most honest work. For a moment, the circle hesitated. A few guests glanced at each other, sensing the shift. The laughter faltered. Even Chloe's smile thinned, her fingers tapping nervously against Daniel's sleeve. I let the silence linger, then offered a polite nod. "Excuse me. I think I'll check on the gallery display." I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the marble like punctuation marks. Behind me, I caught the sound of someone clearing their throat, the bubble of conversation collapsing into an awkward murmur. As I moved toward the far end of the hall, past the portraits and sparkling garlands, my heartbeat steadied. His words no longer had the power to hollow me out the way they once did. 6 months ago, I might have left in tears, driven home with the taste of shame like metal in my mouth. Tonight, I felt something different blooming under my ribs, quiet, steady, like the first note of a song I hadn't heard in years. Near the edge of the room, a young volunteer passed by with a tray of empty glasses. He gave me a quick, uncertain smile, as if he had witnessed something and wasn't sure what to do with it. I returned the smile and kept walking, my fingers brushing the smooth curve of my gown. I paused by a large window overlooking the city, the streets below threaded with headlights. My reflection looked back at me, shoulders straight, eyes calm. Daniel's laughter had once defined these rooms for me. Now it was just background noise. I whispered to myself, so quietly no one else could hear, "I'm not yours to mock anymore." And with that, I let the night carry me forward, toward the gallery display, toward whatever the next chapter of this evening had planned for me. I followed the quiet corridor into the West Gallery, grateful for the dimmer lights and the soft hush that fell like a blanket. The air smelled faintly of varnish and winter coats, and the noise of the main hall faded to a muffled hum behind the doors. My paintings were here. I hadn't been sure if I would even submit them this year. For weeks, the canvases had sat in my small studio, silent witnesses to the hours I spent staring at them, brush hovering in hesitation. But the director had called, insisting my work deserved to be seen, and something in me, a stubborn shard of the woman I used to be, had said yes. I stopped in front of Cranberry Hill in November. The colors were quiet, muted browns, soft grays, the faintest blush of fading berries in the underbrush. A sky the color of wet wool stretched across the frame, holding the promise of snow. I had painted it in the first weeks after Daniel left, when my world felt like this hill, bare, stripped down, waiting for a season that might never arrive. I didn't hear the footsteps at first. Only when a voice spoke behind me did I realize someone else was in the room. "This one feels honest," the man said. His voice was low, warm, the kind that seems to land in the air rather than cut through it. I turned. The man was tall, with a frame that suggested both strength and ease. His hair was silver at the temples, and his tuxedo fit without trying too hard. But it was his eyes I noticed first. Calm, steady, the kind that saw things without rushing to judge them. "Thank you," I said, finding my voice. "It's a hill outside Worcester. I used to drive there to clear my head." He nodded slowly, stepping closer to the painting without crossing the invisible line that would make me retreat. "I know that hill. In late fall, the wind bites, and everything feels suspended. You captured that, the space between endings and beginnings." I blinked. Most people at these galas talked about art like it was a checklist. Pretty, impressive, decorative. This man, this stranger, spoke like he had walked through the same cold air I had breathed when I painted it. "I'm Ethan," he said, offering a hand. "Ethan Cross." Recognition flickered. I'd seen his name in arts newsletters and donor plaques. A man whose contributions kept small museums alive, who bought pieces not to lock them away, but to hang them where people could see. "Grace," I said, shaking his hand. "Grace Miller." He smiled. "I thought so. I saw your name in the program. Your work. It has quiet courage. It doesn't ask for attention, but it stays with you." The words settled over me like warm light. For months, I had doubted every stroke I laid on a canvas, wondering if the world even needed my voice anymore. And now, in a few gentle sentences, a stranger had reached into that hollow space and touched something real. We stood side by side, looking at the painting. Neither of us spoke for a moment, and it wasn't uncomfortable. It felt like breathing after holding my lungs tight for too long. Behind us, the murmur of the party drifted faintly through the doorway. I thought of Daniel in the other room, laughing his rehearsed laugh, performing his life. For the first time that night, I felt the invisible tether between us loosen just a little. Ethan gestured lightly toward the painting. "Would you walk me through your process? I'd like to understand what the sky is saying here." I found myself nodding, words rising without the usual weight of self-doubt. I told him about the late drive, the way the light had caught on the last stubborn berries, the stillness that had felt almost like a held breath. He listened, not the way people listen to reply, but the way they listen to keep a fragment of your story safe. And in that quiet gallery, surrounded by brushstrokes of my own making, I realized this night was shifting. Not loudly, not with fireworks, but with the quiet certainty that I was stepping into a new chapter, one that belonged entirely to me. Ethan stayed beside me, his eyes lingering on the soft gray sky in Cranberry Hill in November. After a long pause, he said quietly, "I know that kind of silence. My wife and I used to drive through Vermont every fall. After she passed, I kept going alone. The hills felt empty at first, but eventually they became a companion of sorts, familiar in their stillness." I turned toward him, surprised by the rawness in his tone. He wasn't performing, he was remembering. There was a quiet thread of grief in his voice, the kind that doesn't ask for pity but simply exists, like a scar you've learned to live with. "I'm sorry," I said softly. He nodded, as if acknowledging the weight of the words but not letting them pull him down. "I think that's why your painting stopped me. It feels like that exact moment, when the world isn't loud enough to hurt anymore, but it isn't warm yet either. It's just honest." Something inside me shifted. For months, I had been carrying my own silence, mistaking it for weakness. Hearing him name it as a kind of truth felt like someone had opened a window in a room I didn't realize was suffocating me. I found myself telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone outside my small circle of colleagues. How the studio above the coffee shop became my refuge. How I would drive out to quiet hills and rivers with a thermos of coffee, chasing light I wasn't sure I could capture. How painting felt like the only place where my life wasn't a story of absence. Ethan listened, his hands loosely folded in front of him, his expression steady. There was no judgment, no impatience, just presence. A flicker of movement caught the corner of my eye. Through the open archway into the main hall, I saw Daniel. His posture was as rigid as marble, his glass held midair as he watched us from across the room. Chloe said something to him, but he didn't answer right away. His gaze was pinned to the gallery, his jaw tight. I realized, with a quiet jolt, that he had never seen me like this. Not performing, not apologizing, not orbiting his spotlight. Just myself. Ethan followed my glance and then looked back at me, a small, knowing smile in his eyes, though he didn't comment. Instead, He stepped half a pace closer to the painting and said, "There's a strength in this kind of work. It doesn't shout, but it doesn't need to. It trusts the right people will hear it." The words landed deeper than I expected. All evening, I had been walking through shadows of old pain, brushing against memories that once defined me. And now, standing in this quiet gallery, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Seen. Not because of a name on my arm, not because of a role I was playing, but because of the person I actually was. From the corner of my vision, Daniel shifted, breaking the stare. He said something to Chloe and turned his back to the gallery, but the stiffness in his shoulders lingered. I wondered if he felt the smallest tremor of loss, the kind that comes when you realize the person you left behind has stepped out of your story and into their own. Ethan glanced toward the doorway and then back at me. "Would you like to see the contemporary wing? It's quieter there. Fewer people trying to impress each other." I let out a small, genuine laugh. "I'd like that." As we walked deeper into the gallery, leaving the main hall behind, I felt a subtle lightness in my chest. The night was no longer about surviving his presence. It was about rediscovering mine. The contemporary wing was quiet, a sanctuary of soft lighting and clean white walls. Yet as my footsteps echoed against the polished floor, a memory stirred that had nothing to do with art. It came uninvited, like the chill that sneaks in through a half-opened window. It was the night I first understood my marriage had cracked. I had been grading papers in the living room, the glow of the fireplace soft against the winter-dark windows. Snow tapped against the glass, and somewhere down the street, a car crunched over ice. I remember feeling settled, safe in a way I had taken for granted. Then Daniel's phone buzzed on the coffee table. Once, twice, a third time. At first, I didn't move. We respected each other's space. Or at least, I thought we did. But the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize. Chloe Y. The preview of a message glowed in the dim room. I can't stop thinking about last night. I remember the way my breath caught, sharp and dry. My fingers hovered above the phone for a second before I touched the screen. A cascade of messages scrolled upward. Flirtation, plans, late-night whispers that I had never been part of. The world shifted on its axis. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the kind of quiet that roars inside your skull. I heard the garage door open, the crunch of his shoes on the mat. My body moved on instinct. I stood, still holding the phone, and faced the entryway. "Grace," he called, casual, like nothing in the world was wrong. I didn't speak at first. I just held up the phone, the screen a glowing betrayal between us. He froze, keys dangling from his hand. For a moment, I thought he might deny it. But he only sighed, set the keys down, and said in a voice that was infuriatingly calm, "I guess you know now." "Who is she?" My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, thin, stretched. "Her name is Chloe," he said, taking off his coat slowly. "She makes me feel alive again, like I'm not just existing." The words landed like ice water on my skin. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to demand that he take them back. Instead, my hand trembled, and the phone slipped from my fingers onto the hardwood. A nearby vase, a gift from our 5th anniversary, tipped with the motion, shattering into a spray of porcelain and water. The flowers lay in a crumpled heap, petals soaking in the mess. Daniel didn't move to pick them up. He just stood there, watching me absorb the fracture of our life. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said finally, and the detached tone in his voice cut deeper than any shout could have. "I just can't keep pretending. I need something different." Something different. As if I were a room he'd grown bored of. I remember sinking to my knees, not from weakness, but from the weight of everything collapsing inside me. The house felt too big. every wall echoing with the silence of a love that had evaporated without warning. That night, I didn't cry right away. I just sat on the cold floor among the shards and the flowers, the phone still glowing nearby. It was as if the version of my life I had known had died quietly, leaving only the hum of the refrigerator and the sharp scent of spilled water. In the gallery now, I blinked, and the memory dissolved back into the white walls and the soft hum of the climate system. My hands had curled into fists without realizing it. I exhaled slowly, forcing my fingers to relax. The woman in that memory had been broken open. The woman standing here tonight had stitched herself together, scar by scar. The hum of the gallery's air system faded into the background as I drifted toward the tall windows at the end of the room. Beyond the glass, the city shimmered under a thin veil of frost, streetlights glinting on snow-dusted roofs. My reflection hovered there, half merged with the night. I reached up and touched the silver necklace around my neck. I had bought it for myself 3 months after the divorce, on a quiet Tuesday morning when the world still felt gray. It wasn't expensive, just a delicate pendant in the shape of a small leaf, but to me, it had been an act of defiance, a promise that I would no longer wait for someone else to make me feel worthy of gifts. My fingers traced the cool metal, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the echo of Daniel's absence pressing on my chest. That emptiness had been my shadow for months, creeping into every corner of my life. My morning coffee, my walks to campus, the hollow space in bed where he used to sleep. I had thought healing would be loud, dramatic, like in the movies. But instead, it had been a series of small, stubborn choices. Waking up and painting for 10 minutes, even when the canvas stared back blankly. Saying yes to lunch with a colleague instead of hiding in my office. Smiling at the barista downstairs, just because it felt human. I remembered the first day I had worn this necklace. I had caught my reflection in a window and thought, "You're still here. Not the wife, not the abandoned woman, just Grace." The muffled sound of the string quartet drifted in from the main hall, weaving through the gallery like a thread pulling me gently back to the present. The music swelled into a slow, elegant waltz, the kind that begged for polished shoes and whispered invitations to the dance floor. I closed my eyes for a moment and let it wash over me. My mind didn't go to Daniel. It went to the quiet of my studio, the smell of linseed oil and coffee, the soft scrape of brush against canvas. It went to the image of my own hand signing the gallery submission form, the small thrill of stepping into this room tonight without anyone by my side. When I opened my eyes, my reflection looked different. The pendant rested at the hollow of my throat, catching the light from the chandelier. My shoulders were back. My gaze was steady. I realized with a ripple of quiet astonishment that I had rebuilt something Daniel could never touch, my own sense of self. Behind me, footsteps approached, soft against the marble. I didn't need to turn to know it was Ethan. His presence had that kind of calm weight, like a door opening to a room I hadn't dared enter in years. "You look like you belong here," he said gently. I glanced at him over my shoulder. I wasn't sure I did when I arrived. "You do," he said simply. From the corner of my eye, I caught movement in the archway. Daniel stood at the edge of the main hall, scanning the gallery with a look I couldn't quite name. Curiosity, unease, maybe even regret. He hesitated for a second, then disappeared back into the crowd. The music from the quartet deepened, the cello warm and low. In the distance, I heard the faint shuffle of feet as couples began to dance in the grand hall. A wave of anticipation stirred in me, not of fear, but of possibility. I turned fully toward Ethan, feeling the cool weight of the necklace against my skin like a quiet reminder. I had survived the breaking. I had stitched myself back together. And now, for the first time in a long time, I was ready for the next note. The music from the main hall floated into the gallery like a gentle tide, curling around the columns and sweeping across the polished floor. The quartet had moved into a waltz now. Slow, graceful, the kind of melody that carries both memory and hope in each note. Ethan glanced toward the sound, then back at me. His expression was calm but warm, as though he had made up his mind about something. "Would you like to dance?" he asked. The question caught me off guard, though it shouldn't have. It was so simple, so human, yet it had been years since anyone had invited me into a moment that wasn't scripted by obligation or pretense. For a heartbeat, I hesitated, the echo of old self-consciousness brushing against me. But then the pendant at my throat shifted, catching the light, and I remembered who I had become. "Yes," I said. He offered his hand, and I placed mine in it, surprised at how steady my fingers felt. His palm was warm, grounding. He led me toward the archway, and the sound of the waltz swelled as we stepped into the grand hall. The chandeliers above spilled golden light across the room, scattering it over marble floors and polished shoes. Couples twirled slowly, their movements a mix of elegance and nostalgia, like scenes from another time. I felt the weight of a few curious gazes as we walked onto the dance floor, but for once, it didn't make me shrink. Ethan placed his hand lightly at my back, and we began to move. The first steps were tentative. I hadn't danced in years, and my body remembered hesitation before it remembered rhythm. But he guided me with an easy confidence, and soon the music seemed to settle into my bones. One step forward, one step to the side, a gentle turn. I became aware of everything at once, the soft slide of satin against my skin as my gown shifted with each step, the reflection of the chandelier in the polished floor, the distant scent of roses and champagne. My heart beat in time with the music, steady and present, like it hadn't been in years. Halfway through the song, something inside me loosened. I let go of the imaginary audience in my mind, the one that had haunted me since the divorce. For the first time, I wasn't the abandoned woman walking into a room of whispers. I was simply a woman dancing, under golden light, in her own story. As we turned, the room blurred slightly around us, a swirl of color and motion. I caught a glimpse of Daniel at the edge of the crowd. His expression was hard to read, part disbelief, part irritation, but it slid off me like water on glass. For so long, my self-worth had been tethered to that man's attention, his approval, his absence. Tonight, I felt the cord snap quietly, leaving me lighter than I ever expected. Ethan leaned slightly closer, not in acclaim, not in possession, just in connection. "You move well," he said softly. I was terrified for the first 3 steps, I admitted with a small laugh. He chuckled, the sound low and kind. No one could tell. The music carried us into a slow turn, and I let my eyes drift upward to the chandeliers. The crystals caught the light in shards, scattering it across my skin, across his shoulder, across the marble like tiny stars. I felt free. Not in the grand, cinematic way I used to imagine, but in a quiet, profound sense. Like breathing clean air after a long, heavy winter. When the final notes lingered in the air, I realized I was smiling. Not the polite smile I had worn for years at these events. A real one. The final notes of the waltz lingered in the air like the last breath of winter before spring. I felt the music in my chest, my heart rising with it, and when it stopped, the silence carried its own kind of weight. Ethan slowed our steps to a gentle halt, and for a moment, the world shrank to just the two of us standing under the chandeliers. Then he lifted my hand. It wasn't dramatic, not the way movies would frame it. His gesture was calm, deliberate, almost reverent. He turned my hand slightly, his fingers warm against mine, and pressed a soft kiss to the back of it. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. But in that heartbeat, I heard the collective intake of breath around us. The room had gone still. Conversations faltered. The clink of glasses paused midair, and a ripple of attention spread across the hall. I became aware of dozens of eyes on me, curious, surprised, some quietly envious. From the edge of the crowd, I spotted Daniel. His jaw was tight, his hand frozen on the stem of his wineglass. Chloe's smile had turned brittle, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into his sleeve as if to anchor herself. Once upon a time, their attention would have set me on fire with embarrassment. Tonight, it didn't scorch. It illuminated. Someone began to clap, hesitant, then louder. The sound spread, a polite but unmistakable acknowledgement of the moment. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, not from shame, but from something new and unfamiliar. Pride. Ethan lowered my hand gently. He didn't look around to check the reaction. He didn't need to. His focus was entirely on me, and that was what steadied me in the storm of attention. "You did beautifully," he said softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "I haven't danced like that in years." "Could have fooled me," he said with a small smile, the corners of his eyes crinkling. Around us, the gala began to breathe again. The quartet shifted into a new song, couples returned to the floor, and the moment dispersed like confetti into the night. But I knew, and Daniel knew, that something had shifted. I glanced once more toward him. His expression was a carefully constructed mask, but I had spent years learning the tiny muscles of his face. Behind the neutral facade, irritation simmered, maybe even regret. Chloe whispered something in his ear, but his eyes stayed on me for one beat longer than necessary. I let the glance roll off me like rain off a window. His opinion no longer defined me. Ethan offered his arm, and we stepped gracefully off the dance floor. As we moved toward the gallery side, a few guests murmured compliments or smiled as we passed. I returned each one with a polite nod, feeling an unexpected lightness in my chest. We paused near the tall windows, the city lights stretching below like constellations. The reflection in the glass caught us side by side, my gown flowing, his tuxedo sharp, and for the first time, I didn't see a woman left behind. I saw a woman who had chosen to walk back into her life and claim it. "I think," I said quietly, almost to myself, "I needed that." Ethan didn't press for explanation. He just nodded, understanding threaded through the silence between us. Somewhere behind us, laughter rose again from the main hall, bright, performative, the kind I used to chase like approval. It reached my ears and faded, powerless now to touch me. The night wasn't over yet, but something fundamental had already shifted. The past no longer held me in its grip, and for the first time in a long while, I felt not like a supporting character, but the author of my own story. I slipped away from the main hall, letting the soft hum of conversation fade behind me. The corridor leading to the side terrace was dimmer, quieter, as if the museum itself understood that some moments needed fewer witnesses. The cool air from the terrace met me first, smelling faintly of snow and city stone. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and stepped toward the balustrade. The city stretched out below, lights shimmering across the frozen river. For a moment, I simply breathed, letting the cold settle into my lungs, letting the night wash the adrenaline from my veins. I had almost convinced myself I was alone when I heard the soft click of shoes on marble behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. Years of shared space had taught me the rhythm of Daniel's footsteps, the weight he carried even in silence. "Grace," he said, his voice low and careful. I turned slowly, leaning one elbow on the cold stone railing. He stood just inside the terrace doorway, hands in his pockets, the glow from the hall behind him catching in his hair. "You look..." He hesitated, as if the words got tangled somewhere between pride and regret. "Well, thank you," I said simply. My voice surprised me with its steadiness. He stepped closer, the distance between us shrinking but never quite closing. His eyes searched my face, the way they used to when he was deciding how much of himself to reveal. "I didn't expect to see you here tonight," he admitted. I tilted my head slightly. "Why? Because you thought I'd stay away?" He flinched, just barely. "I wasn't sure you'd want to." I let the words hang there, like a fragment of a past life. Once I would have filled the silence with explanations, with questions, with pleas for clarity. Tonight, I let the quiet do the work. After a long moment, he exhaled and glanced toward the city. "I saw you dancing." I didn't answer. "You seemed happy," he added, softer this time, almost like it wasn't a statement but a confession. I studied him. The perfectly cut tuxedo, the line of tension in his shoulders, the flicker of something vulnerable in his eyes. This was a man who had always believed he could step cleanly from one life into another, never looking back. But tonight, under the soft halo of winter light, I saw the cracks. "Daniel," I said finally, "what did you expect to find out here?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. His jaw worked as if he was weighing each word, then discarding it. What he didn't say filled the air between us. "I made a mistake. I miss what I threw away. I thought you'd still be waiting in the shadow of what we were." Instead, he said, "I just wanted to say, I hope you're okay." The old me would have heard those words like an apology, like a lifeline to the history we shared. The woman standing here now just felt peaceful. "I am," I said simply. "Better than okay, actually." He nodded once, eyes flicking to the necklace at my throat, the gown, the posture he hadn't seen in years. I could see the realization settle in. The version of me he had left behind no longer existed. The wind picked up, carrying a faint echo of music from the hall. I straightened, feeling its weightless rhythm move through me. "Enjoy your evening, Daniel," I said, my tone calm, almost kind. And for the first time in our entire history, I turned my back on him without a single ounce of guilt. The marble floor was cold under my heels as I walked back toward the golden light of the hall, leaving the shadow of our past on the terrace where it belonged. The marble hallway felt warmer as I stepped away from the terrace, leaving the cold and Daniel behind. My heels tapped softly against the floor, a measured rhythm that seemed to echo the steadiness in my chest. I had expected that seeing him, hearing his voice again, standing in that pocket of memory, might unravel me. Instead, I felt lighter. For years, my heart had been a locked room where pain sat like a permanent tenant. But walking away from that terrace felt like I had finally opened a window and let the air change. I paused near a tall mirror framed in gold, catching my own reflection. My hair had loosened slightly from the dance, a soft wave escaping near my cheek. The silver pendant at my throat glinted under the chandelier's light. My eyes. They didn't look like the eyes of a woman abandoned anymore. They were steady, luminous in a quiet way. That realization was the final thread snapping. I didn't need Daniel's words, his approval, or even his regret to close the chapter. It was already closed the moment I chose to stand here in my own story. From the main hall, the music swelled again, and a familiar warmth pulled me forward. I stepped through the archway, letting the golden light wrap around me like a new skin. Guests were still mingling, laughing, and sipping champagne, but the moment I crossed back into the room, my gaze found Ethan. He was standing near one of the tall windows talking to a curator, but as if sensing me, he turned. His expression shifted immediately, a calm recognition softening his features. Our eyes met across the space, and a quiet smile spread on his face. Not possessive, not questioning, just welcoming. I walked toward him, not in a rush, each step grounding me in the present. With every footfall, I felt the past loosen its grip a little more. "Back from the cold?" Ethan asked when I reached him, his voice a gentle hum under the music. "Yes," I said, a small laugh curling out of me. "And it feels different now. Like I can breathe." He didn't press for details. He didn't need to. There was something in his gaze that told me he understood more than words could cover. Around us, the gala moved on, unaware that a quiet revolution had taken place in my life. Daniel's laughter rose briefly from the other side of the hall, but it no longer carried the weight it once had. It was just noise now, fading into the general hum of the evening. Ethan gestured toward the gallery. "Would you like to take one more walk before the night ends? The side hall is almost empty now. It's peaceful there." "I would," I said. As we strolled toward the quieter wing, I glanced once over my shoulder. Through the shifting crowd, I caught sight of Daniel and Chloe. He was speaking to another guest, but for a fleeting second, his gaze flicked toward me. There was no smile this time, no attempt to perform. Only an unreadable stillness. I turned back and let the moment pass, leaving it behind like the echo of a closed door. The gallery lights reflected softly on the marble floor as we walked. I felt the weight of the night settle into a kind of calm certainty. I had survived the shattering. I had walked through the dark room of grief and come out holding my own hand. When we paused in front of my painting again, Ethan gave me a look that was both quiet and affirming. "You belong here," he said, just as he had before. And for the first time, I didn't doubt it. The valet brought my car around just as the last notes of the gala drifted into the cold air. I stepped out from under the museum's golden awning, pulling my coat tighter as a soft swirl of snow brushed against my face. Boston in winter had a way of feeling both alive and hushed, as if the whole city paused to listen to the rhythm of its own heart. The car door closed with a gentle thump, and I eased onto the quiet street. The tires crunched over thin layers of ice, and the city unfolded around me in shades of silver and amber. Streetlights spilled warm halos onto the snowbanks, and in the distance, the Charles River shimmered under the night sky. Driving through the city that night felt like gliding through memory. Each landmark whispered pieces of the journey I had taken to get here. Not the literal drive, but the invisible road from heartbreak to freedom. I passed the cafe below my studio. Its windows glowed with the soft light of a single bulb, empty tables waiting for the morning rush. I remembered all the afternoons I'd sat upstairs with cold coffee and silent canvases, wondering if I had anything left to offer the world. Those days had been my winter, the kind that feels endless when the light sets early and the silence lingers too long. The light turned green, and I drove on, past the brownstones that lined the back bay, their windows warm with the lives of strangers. I imagined the families inside, the clink of dishes, the hum of televisions, the ordinary happiness I used to envy. Tonight, I didn't envy it. I just noticed it, quietly, without longing. My life didn't have to look like anyone else's to feel full. The snow picked up a little as I turned toward my neighborhood, soft flakes swirling in the glow of the street lamps. I slowed the car, letting the scene soak in, the way the light fractured on the windshield, the rhythm of the wipers clearing my view, the faint hum of the heater. It was mundane and profound all at once. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. My cheeks were still flushed from the warmth of the museum, my eyes bright with something I hadn't seen in them for a long time: peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's choices, but the kind that comes from finally choosing yourself. I thought about the moment on the dance floor, the soft kiss on my hand, the weightless feeling of being seen without being owned. I thought about leaving the terrace, about how Daniel's voice no longer had hooks in it. The old pain was still part of me, but it no longer ran the show. As I crossed the bridge toward home, the Charles stretched out on either side, dark and glassy. Snowflakes hit the water and vanished, leaving no trace. I lowered the window just an inch, letting the cold air sting my lungs. It felt like baptism, like the city itself was whispering, "You've made it through." When I pulled onto my street, the world was quiet. My building's brick facade glowed under the street lamp, and the steps leading up to the front door were dusted in white. I parked, sat for a moment with the engine off, and let the silence settle around me. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was mine. I walked slowly up the steps, the crunch of snow under my heels echoing in the stillness. When I reached the door, I paused and glanced back at the city lights in the distance. For the first time, they didn't feel far away or unreachable. They felt like part of my story, and my story was finally my own. I slipped into my car again after taking a short walk around the block, brushing the light snow from my coat. The driver's seat felt warm from the residual heat, a small comfort against the bite of the winter air. I closed the door and let the quiet wrap around me, different from the quiet that used to haunt my old life. This one felt chosen. The street outside my building was nearly empty. A single lamppost threw a circle of golden light over the thin layer of snow, turning every flake into a tiny spark. I adjusted the rearview mirror, and for the first time that night, I really saw myself. My hair was a little mussed from the dance and the wind. My cheeks were still rosy from the cold. But what stopped me was the expression in my own eyes. There was a steadiness there I hadn't seen in years, a quiet triumph that no one had given me but myself. I thought about the woman I had been on that first night alone after Daniel left, the one who sat on the kitchen floor with the fridge humming behind her, phone in hand, heart cracking open. She would not have believed this moment could exist, a night where she walked into a room full of ghosts and left carrying only herself, whole and unshaken. The engine was off, and the car hummed softly in the cooling night. I leaned back against the seat, letting the streetlight frame my reflection. The city beyond the windshield blurred into a warm constellation of gold and white. And then, almost without realizing it, I smiled. It wasn't a performance. It wasn't for anyone else to see. It was small, real, and completely mine. In that moment, the truth settled in my chest with the weight of clarity. I didn't need revenge to win. I didn't need the room to gasp or Daniel to beg for forgiveness. My life, my freedom, my quiet joy. These were my victory. A soft laugh slipped out, surprising me. It was light, unburdened, and it echoed in the small cabin like a song only I could hear. I touched the pendant at my throat, that tiny silver leaf I had bought when I decided to start again, and realized I had kept my promise to myself. I thought about Ethan, about the way he had looked at my painting as if he could see the weather of my soul, about the gentle weight of his hand leading me through the waltz. His presence had been a mirror, too, one that reflected not just who I was to him, but who I had become for myself. Outside, a snowflake landed on the windshield and melted instantly, leaving a tiny bead of water sliding down the glass. It reminded me of all the nights I thought I would drown in my own grief, only to find that it would pass, drop by drop, until light returned. I started the engine, letting the heater hum to life. The dashboard lights glowed softly, illuminating my hands on the steering wheel. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the warmth and the knowledge that the hardest part of my journey was behind me. Before shifting into gear, I glanced at the mirror one last time. My smile was still there, steady and unshakable. I whispered to the quiet car, "We're okay now." and I meant it. Morning light spilled into my studio like a soft tide, brushing across the walls and settling on the canvases that leaned in quiet rows. The winter sun in Boston wasn't generous, but when it did appear, it came with a clarity that felt almost ceremonial. Today, it filled the small space above the coffee shop, turning dust motes into tiny sparks and washing over the new paintings I had been too shy to show anyone. I wrapped my hands around a mug of coffee, letting the heat seep into my fingers. The night before felt like a dream I had walked through barefoot. Fragile, vivid, and strangely grounding. The museum's chandeliers and the swirl of the waltz had been left behind, but the feeling they gave me lingered in my chest. I set the mug down and moved toward my easel. A canvas waited there, half finished, the rough outline of a frozen river cutting across its surface. I had sketched it weeks ago, on a day when the cold outside had seeped into my bones and I couldn't imagine warmth returning. Now, looking at it in the morning sun, I saw something different. The blank sections no longer felt like emptiness. They felt like possibility. I picked up a brush. The first stroke was tentative, the bristles whispering across the canvas. Then another, and another, until the rhythm of creation took over. Color began to gather where it hadn't before. Soft whites for the snow, pale blue shadows stretching across the river, and the faintest hint of gold where the morning sun might land. As I painted, my mind drifted back to the version of myself who had first stepped into this studio after the divorce. She had been smaller somehow, curled in on herself, afraid to take up space in her own life. She had stared at blank canvases and wondered if she had anything left to say, if her voice mattered without someone else to echo it. I glanced around the room now and realized how far I had come. My art wasn't silent anymore. It spoke, even if only in whispers, and I had learned to listen. The city below the window was slowly waking. I could hear the distant sound of a bus, the crunch of boots on icy sidewalks, and the hiss of the espresso machine from the cafe downstairs. Life was moving, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was moving with it. Not as a shadow, not as an afterthought, but as myself. A soft chime from my phone pulled me from the canvas. I wiped my hands on a cloth and checked the screen. An email notification. Good morning, Grace. Last night reminded me why I love supporting local art. If you're willing, I'd like to discuss showcasing your work at the spring exhibition. Ethan. I read it twice, warmth blooming in my chest. It wasn't just about the opportunity. It was about being seen, truly seen, for what I had built from the fragments of my old life. I placed the phone aside and returned to the painting, a smile tugging at the corner of my mouth. The brush moved easier now, as if it had been waiting for this moment of quiet certainty. Through the window, the sunlight shifted, landing directly on my silver pendant. I touched it briefly, letting the cool metal remind me of the promise I had made to myself months ago. To keep living, to keep creating, to keep choosing me. The world outside continued in its rhythm, and I realized that the most profound victories aren't always loud. Sometimes they're just mornings like this. Warm coffee, soft light, and a heart finally at peace with its own reflection. The painting on my easel had taken shape by the time the sun climbed higher, scattering light across the studio floor. Pale blues, soft whites, and thin streaks of gold ran across the canvas like the river had learned to hold its own light. I stepped back to look at it and felt something I hadn't in a long time: completion, not just of the painting, but of a chapter of my life. The gentle ping of another notification pulled me from my thoughts. This time, it wasn't an email, but a message from a friend who had also attended the gala. You're everywhere this morning. Check the museum's social feed. Curiosity stirred, and I opened my laptop. There it was, the photo. Someone had captured the exact moment Ethan kissed my hand under the chandelier's golden light. The frame was perfect. The soft flare of crystals above us, my navy gown sweeping the marble floor. Ethan poised with the easy grace of someone who didn't need attention to hold a room. The caption from the museum read, "A timeless moment at the Winter Arts Gala. Elegance meets authenticity." Below it, comments had already started. People called the image cinematic, the highlight of the evening, proof that art lives in every corner of the room. My name was tagged alongside Ethan's, and for the first time, I didn't flinch seeing it in public. It wasn't the name of someone's ex-wife. It was my name, standing on its own. I scrolled a little further and found another post, a short clip of the waltz. The camera panned across the dance floor, catching the moment I laughed mid-turn. My head tipped back in a way that looked effortless and free. Watching it, I almost didn't recognize myself. Not because I looked different, but because I could see it. The shift that had been building quietly all night. The woman in the video wasn't trying to belong. She already did. A soft laugh escaped me as I closed the laptop. My studio was filled with sunlight now, stretching across the floorboards and catching on the edges of every frame. I brewed another cup of coffee and let the aroma mix with the faint scent of oil paint and winter air. The world outside was moving on. Cars hummed down the street, the cafe below clattered with the first rush of customers, and somewhere in the distance, a snow shovel scraped the sidewalk. Life was simple, and for once, that simplicity felt like luxury. I thought briefly of Daniel, of Chloe, of the life I had left behind. There was no bitterness in the thought, no pang of longing, just a quiet acknowledgement, like turning the last page of a book and placing it gently back on the shelf. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was another message from Ethan. "Take your time today. The world already saw the part that matters. The rest is yours to keep." I stared at the words for a moment, a warmth blooming deep in my chest. He was right. The night had been spectacular. But this quiet morning with its soft light and private joy, was the true victory. I glanced at the finished painting one last time, the river catching the morning sun, and felt my own reflection in it. Steady, clear, free. With a deep breath, I opened the window to let the crisp winter air in. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the glass, landing on the sill and melting into tiny droplets. I let the air fill the studio, carrying with it the quiet hum of the city, the scent of new beginnings, and the certainty that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. My life was my own again, my story too, and that was the most elegant ending I could have imagined.